The images came quietly, almost clinically. A US operation overnight. A foreign leader seized. A government decapitated before the world could even react. If you live in Taiwan, your heart may have skipped a beat. And if you sit in Beijing, you almost certainly took notes. And moments like this matter far beyond the country where they occur. Because power today is not announced, it is demonstrated, swiftly, decisively, without apology. At first glance, Venezuela feels distant from East Asia. Different geography, different politics, different history. But the message of the raid was universal. When a superpower decides to act, the old rules may not slow it down. That is why this episode echoed across the Taiwan Strait. If you want to understand how China is really thinking about Taiwan right now, not emotionally, but strategically, stay with me. What looks like a Latin American crisis is in fact a mirror held up to Asia. And once you see the reflection, you can't unsee it. Now, let's step back and define the real question this moment forces us to ask. To ask whether Venezuela signals an imminent move on Taiwan is, in some ways, the wrong question. The real issue is not imitation, it is interpretation. Beijing is not scanning the Americas for a legal precedent. It is studying something far more important: capability, restraint, and response. China has long been clear about one thing. Taiwan, in its view, is not a matter of international relations. It is a domestic political question. That framing changes everything. Unlike Venezuela, Taiwan is not seen in Beijing as a sovereign peer protected by international law. It is seen as unfinished business. That is why China's strategy toward the island has not relied on courtroom arguments or UN resolutions. It has relied on pressure. Coercion without open war, military drills, diplomatic isolation, economic leverage. So when Chinese commentators dismiss comparisons with Venezuela, they are not deflecting, they are clarifying their worldview. But here is the paradox. Even if the analogy is rejected in theory, the demonstration of power cannot be ignored in practice. And that takes us to the deeper forces shaping this moment: history, imbalance, and the long shadow of unresolved conflicts. To understand why this moment resonates, we need to widen the lens and look backward. The Taiwan question is not a sudden crisis. It is the residue of history. A civil war left unfinished, a political separation frozen in time. For Beijing, this is not about expansion. It is about closure. For decades, China has grown richer, stronger, and more confident, while the issue of Taiwan has remained unresolved, sitting uncomfortably at the center of its national narrative. Power imbalances matter here. China today commands the world's largest armed forces. Taiwan is a self-governing island of 23 million people, living under the shadow of a giant next door. The asymmetry is real, just as it is between the United States and Venezuela. But history shows us that imbalance alone does not determine outcomes. What matters is the mechanism through which power is applied. China has favored gradual pressure over sudden violence. Military exercises, airspace incursions, economic signals, a slow tightening meant to reshape psychology before reshaping borders. Yet history also teaches us something else. Long-standing stalemates tend to end not with negotiation, but with shocks. And that is why sudden actions like the one we just witnessed feel so destabilizing, because they suggest how quickly the ground can shift. Then came the shock, an overnight operation. Precision, speed, a leader removed before dawn. Venezuela did not fall after months of bombing or prolonged conflict. It was neutralized through a decapitation strike, a reminder that modern power does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives with silence. This is where the Venezuela episode cuts deeper than many expected. Not because it offers a blueprint, but because it exposes a vulnerability. Venezuela was heavily armed. Much of that arsenal came from China. And yet, when the moment came, it did not matter. For observers in Taiwan, this raised an unsettling question. If Chinese-made systems could not slow a US operation there, what would happen here? And for strategists in Beijing, the implication was even more uncomfortable. The United States demonstrated not just military superiority, but operational confidence, the ability to act decisively, absorb criticism, and move on. If you're finding this analysis clarifying, take a moment to reflect on it or share it with someone who still thinks global power works the way it did 20 years ago. Because this was not just a warning shot, it was a data point. And it forces us to confront the machinery beneath the headlines, the hidden mechanisms that truly shape deterrence today. What the Venezuela raid really revealed was not intent, but mechanism. Deterrence today is no longer built only on troop numbers or hardware. It rests on three invisible pillars: speed, integration, and credibility. The United States did not overwhelm Venezuela by matching force with force. It bypassed resistance altogether. Intelligence, coordination, and decision-making moved faster than defense systems could react. This is the part that matters most for Beijing. China has invested heavily in visible power ships, jets, missiles, drills staged for the camera. But the Venezuela episode highlighted something less theatrical: the ability to conduct a clean decapitation strike against a system designed in part with Chinese technology. That creates doubt. And in geopolitics, doubt is corrosive. The People's Liberation Army has been preparing for scenarios around Taiwan for years, emphasizing blockades, denial of access, and overwhelming force. But those strategies assume time. They assume escalation. They assume warning. Venezuela showed a different model, one where the critical battle is decided before escalation begins. And once that possibility enters strategic thinking, every plan must be reconsidered, because the next crisis is not always louder than the last one. Sometimes it is simply faster. Then Beijing responded the only way it knows how to answer uncertainty: with forceful signaling. Within days, the People's Liberation Army intensified its drills around Taiwan. Warships encircled the island. Fighter jets crossed median lines. The message was unmistakable: China can squeeze Taiwan, isolate it, and make intervention costly. This was not theater for Taipei alone. It was aimed at Washington. The PLA has been clear about its ambitions. By 2027, it seeks the ability to achieve what US defense planners call a strategic, decisive victory. Not a long war, a short one that presents the world with a fait accompli before alliances can mobilize. But here is the tension. The Venezuela operation injected a new variable into that calculus. It reminded everyone that speed cuts both ways. That escalation can be preempted, that command centers, leaders, and assumptions can disappear overnight. For China, this creates a dilemma. Delay favors Taiwan's legitimacy and international ties. Action risks testing American resolve in real time. So drills grow louder, posturing grows sharper, but beneath the noise lies hesitation, not about capability, but about consequence. And that brings us away from generals and war rooms and toward the people who would live with the fallout. Because strategy is abstract, but its costs are deeply human. If you live in Taiwan, none of this feels theoretical. You are not a chess piece. You are not a talking point on cable news. You are someone going to work, raising a family, planning a future under the constant awareness that history could interrupt your life without warning. That is why the Venezuela episode landed so differently. It was not fear that dominated the conversation. It was recognition. Power punishes weakness, but it also exploits isolation. Venezuela's leader fell not just because of American strength, but because his legitimacy had eroded, because his country stood alone. Taiwan, by contrast, draws its strength from cohesion, from public support, from the quiet daily legitimacy of a society that functions, votes, debates, and endures. And this is where you matter. Deterrence is not only built in defense budgets, it is built in unity, in credibility, in the sense that a society cannot be easily fractured or dismissed. If this perspective resonates, pause for a moment, share it, talk about it, because understanding power is not pessimism, it is preparation. And the world is watching how Taiwan prepares. Next, we have to zoom out beyond the island and see how this moment reverberates across the global system. What happens in Taiwan never stays in Taiwan. The Venezuela raid underscored a reality that many capitals already sense. The global order is becoming less predictable, more transactional, and more tolerant of force. When rules are bent in one region, they weaken everywhere. China understood this immediately. That is why it moved with Russia to call for an emergency meeting at the United Nations, not out of sympathy for Venezuela, but out of concern for precedent. When powerful states act first and justify later, smaller states everywhere must recalculate their risks. For allies in Asia, the signal was mixed. On one hand, the United States demonstrated unmatched operational reach. On the other, its willingness to sidestep international norms raised quiet questions about consistency and restraint. This ambiguity ripples outward. It affects Japan's defense planning. It sharpens debates in Southeast Asia. It feeds uncertainty in Europe, where leaders struggle to respond with clarity. In a world this interconnected, deterrence is no longer local. Every action sets off a chain reaction of expectations, fears, and recalculations. And as these reactions accumulate, they begin to shape the future, not through declarations, but through momentum. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this trajectory lead? When the dust settles, moments like this rarely point to a single outcome. They open pathways, and right now, three futures are quietly competing. The first is stability through deterrence. In this scenario, the Venezuela raid strengthens American credibility. Beijing absorbs the lesson, recalibrates its risk tolerance, and continues to rely on pressure short of war. Taiwan remains tense, but intact. Power restrains power. The second future is prolonged ambiguity. China advances its capabilities. The United States signals resolve but avoids commitment. Drills intensify. Norms erode slowly. Nothing breaks yet, nothing feels secure. This is a world of constant rehearsal for a crisis that never quite arrives. The third path is the most dangerous. Miscalculation. A belief that speed can neutralize response, that legitimacy matters less than momentum. In such a world, a single decision made under pressure could turn demonstration into disaster. None of these outcomes is inevitable. They are shaped by perception, patience, and political judgment. History rarely moves in straight lines. It drifts until it doesn't. And that leaves us with one final responsibility: to understand what power can do before it decides to prove it again. What the Venezuela raid ultimately reminds us is this: power no longer waits for consensus. It tests the world in real time. For Taiwan, the lesson is not that invasion is imminent. It is that legitimacy, unity, and preparedness are not abstract virtues, they are strategic assets. For China, the message is more uncomfortable. Capability alone does not guarantee control. Speed can deter, but it can also provoke consequences that spiral beyond calculation. And for the rest of us, watching from afar, this moment marks something larger: the steady fading of a world where rules restrain force and the rise of one where credibility does. I've spent years studying global power shifts, and one truth keeps returning. History does not announce its turning points. It disguises them as isolated events. Venezuela may look like one story, Taiwan another, but they are chapters in the same book. The question is not whether the world is changing. It already has. The question is whether we understand the change before it defines us. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it, continue the conversation, and stay with me, because the next chapter is already being written faster than most people realize.